welcome to this, our second panel discussion exploring the essential role of compassion in shaping the post-COVID-19 new normal. My name is Sana Qadar. I'm the host of All in the Mind, a show all about the brain and behavior on ABC Radio National, and I'll be your host and moderator for these discussions. On behalf of the University of Queensland, the panelists and production team, I acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians of the lands from which we are variously connected today. We pay our respects to their ancestors and their descendants and recognise their valuable contributions to Australian and global society. Over the past 12 months, life for everyone on the planet has been changed by a single event, a pandemic of global proportions. It has been a time of restriction and reflection. In addition, COVID-19 has cast a new light on longer-term social, environmental, and economic challenges, and movements such as Me Too, Black Lives Matter, and Extinction Rebellion continue to highlight the most basic flaws in our socio-political systems. Meanwhile, concerns are being raised around the world about growing inequality and the ongoing concentration of wealth by a privileged minority. So what kind of society do we want to live in when the pandemic is over? And what are we prepared to do to ensure we secure it? How can we reimagine the structures and systems by which we live together? In these discussions, we will explore these questions from the perspective of the human capacity for compassion. Now, the word compassion can suggest different ideas in different circumstances. Here, we will be talking about something that is distinct from sympathy, which involves feeling sorry for someone, or empathy, which involves experiencing the feelings of others within oneself. Compassion has two interconnected aspects. The first is a sensitivity to and recognition of suffering and need. The second is a motivation to do something to alleviate that suffering and need. So compassion isn't just about feeling, but doing. And it's this dynamic partnership between sensitivity and action that will inform these discussions. Now, today, our conversation will focus on society and questions around how we can work together to create a healthier, more equitable, and mutually supportive society in which everyone can live with dignity, free from fear, and the want of basic necessities. To explore these challenging questions, we have with us three people with contrasting perspectives. And my first guest is Greg Marston. Professor Greg Marston is Deputy Executive Dean of the Faculty of Humanities and Social Sciences at the University of Queensland. He is an author and social policy analyst with an interest in poverty and unemployment, work in technology, and economic security. He is passionate about social justice issues and the role of education and research in contributing to the kinds of social change that encourage human flourishing. Prior to entering academia, he worked with non-government organizations, researching and developing social policy at a state and national level. Greg is also the Australian representative for the International Basic Income Earth Network, YEN. Greg, over to you.
Great, terrific. Thanks, Sana. I just also wanted to say how much I enjoyed the first forum about compassionate communities. I think it really laid the groundwork for us to think about the sorts of institutions that would promote a compassionate society. And tonight I'll talk a little bit about work and education because I think they're kind of two key ingredients in terms of cultivating a compassionate society, and particularly the interface with the welfare system. And as Sana said, I think that the other thing the forum did, the first one, was kind of imply this notion of compassion, that it is about action, and certainly the domain of policy is one of those action areas that seeks to address a whole range of injustices or social problems, but obviously there's very wide-ranging and competing views about the best ways to do that. So none of what I've got to say is necessarily the panacea or the answer, but it's at least some of the ideas I think that are worth thinking about and gets us asking the right kind of questions, I think. About the pandemic and the moment that we're in, I think the other thing that I'd say is that one of the more pleasing aspects of many national responses across many countries has really been a kind of preparedness to be led by expertise. Rather than prejudice or ideology, and that's really important in policy. It's what we call evidence-informed policy, because we want the best evidence produced, brought to these problems, rather than kind of operating on beliefs, myths, and other kind of ideas that aren't accurate representation of problems. So for us that work in universities, of course, we hope that this is one of the things that sticks during the recovery. But I think it's important too, before we get too hopeful, just to illustrate some of the challenges before we talk about some of the possible solutions in terms of those challenges. So I think, for example, if we take a philosophical view, suffering is always morally regrettable because it suggests that society and how we've organised it is not operating at its optimum level in the distribution of resources and in terms of opportunities. So the question for policymakers is always, what is the appropriate policy response? And on the conservative side, and then on the liberal side, we can have a range of views about how to do this. Where we can have on the more conservative compassionism talking about the ways in which civil society, voluntary agencies, families should be doing the bulk of the heavy lifting in terms of mitigating the risks that we all encounter during the course of our life. And yet on the other side, we might have advocates suggesting that a compassionate response needs to be led by institutions, that we can't rely on emotion and we can't rely on the kind of emotional response that gets created and cultivated during a crisis, that's not sustained, that we need to see human rights, we need to see other virtues embedded in institutions. And I'm certainly someone that's keen to promote that view. Because I think, there are things that when we've done this successfully in the past in terms of institutionalizing these values and virtues. If you think in the mid-20th century, after the World War II, we had a lot of state revenues, for example, and we started to redirect those to mitigating these kinds of risks, that we couldn't rely on civil society to meet the range of needs, particularly in terms of war and depression and so on. So we started to approach this question of compassion at the level of institutional design, not just at individual psychology. And I think that's really important for the points that I want to make, because it's these social institutions like work and schools that teach citizens conceptions of basic goods, responsibilities, and also appropriate concern. And these institutions can either promote or discourage the emotions that impede appropriate compassion, such as shame, envy, and even disgust. So it's not like these institutions are always working towards the forces of good. Obviously, these institutions can also discriminate and exclude. So it's very important in terms of that compassion ethos being embedded in particular ways, but also being practiced. The practice of compassion in these institutions is really important, particularly those at the front line doing service delivery in terms of how they reconcile professional ethics and some of the norms of an organisation. So these are the kind of difficulties that all institutions face. The other thing I'd say about institutions is how we talk about social problems matters, because it can lead our resources in a certain direction. So if you think about the pandemic challenge in terms of building back better, for example, it means questioning stereotypes and labels that reinforce this kind of othering. We need a language that promotes a sense of shared responsibility as we develop a collective understanding about the relationship between privilege and disadvantage, and how we're going to reconcile that so that we have a better distribution of resources and opportunities in society. So that shared responsibility in terms of an idea of social justice, at least for me, is really important. And it's also really difficult to leverage compassion towards a certain group if we consider that group as undeserving of state support, or that group is immoral, that they've acted in ways that reflect bad character. And we do this deliberately in society, and it's done purposely in some cases and a bit mischievously by politicians. For example, when we talk about the asylum seekers that arrive on our shores as illegals or queue jumpers, because we respect the institution of the law, then we're often directed to think of people that as group as breaking the law and therefore as undeserving of state support. So it's really important to kind of challenge those dominant discourses, I think, because otherwise we end up with a kind of misdiagnosis of our social ills, and we put resources towards solutions that simply don't work. So always, I think, in this work for compassion, we need to work at the material level in terms of distributing resources, but we also need to work at the cultural level in cultivating a compassionate society. The other thing I think that's corrosive of compassion that's been taking place over the last 20 or 30 years is really this kind of commodification of human needs. It's been destructive of our sense-making abilities, and economisation kind of impoverishes social relations. It degrades our natural and urban environments, and it generates, I think, a whole lot of negative externalities, the cost of which are never calculated. I think another challenge is that in the age of kind of post-truth politics and then the digital age, citizens are fed a whole lot of curated news feeds on their social media platforms that reinforce their existing beliefs. I mean, we used to think the internet was a democratizing force, but if you look at the ways in which algorithms are working, what often happens is that it sort of reinforces certain confirmation bias. And it also encourages people to channel their anger at people that are really in their close social proximity, rather than at economic systems and forces that are driving increases in inequality. So I think this is also a challenge. At the same time, we've got anxiety and fear being exacerbated by an exaggeration of the dangers of terrorism, crime, and ethnic conflict. So I think under these divisions, the ability to realise that we're all in this together becomes difficult to sustain. So that's just a quick summary of the challenges and why I think the stakes are high. We know that if we get this right and start to turn this around, from public health and population health research that more equal societies are also happier and healthier. And not surprisingly, the citizens in more equal countries have stronger support on action on climate change, in part because these citizens have more bandwidth. They have the luxury of focusing on more than economic survival. So for me, as I get towards a couple of ideas now, I think this economic security and education are really critical. And of course, our democracy has to sustain a conversation that doesn't resort to kind of tribal politics, victim blaming, and short-termism. So turning quickly to education, I think that we've had a focus on education during the pandemic, obviously, in terms of the crisis in the business models and its disrupted teaching modes, but we've also had action on the part of governments to kind of introduce pricing signals to students to pursue, vocational education. And I think that there are some limitations to that if we want the citizens that are capable of this compassion that we'd like to see, and also in terms of taking those values with them, in terms of instilling that courage and conviction. So I do want a couple of moments on that, and then I'll talk very briefly about economic security, and then very interested to see what the other panelists have to say. So I think the thing I'd say about education is that we need an examination of our traditions so that we have an ability to see ourselves not just as a member of a narrow group, because that doesn't promote social cohesion and compassion. We need to see ourselves as part of a heterogeneous nation. We also need our campuses with a diverse student and staff body. People need to see themselves reflected in the institution if they want to feel that they belong. And I think if you think about it, comprehensive university, performing arts and literature can teach us about empathy. And I think we must insist on the crucial importance of the arts, humanities, because they deliver something much more precious than short-term economic profit, because what they do is make a world that's worth living in. We also need our historians to reach past the Industrial Revolution into earlier times to help us remember ideas about the good society, where a life well lived was not subsumed within a paid work ethic. And I think this is really critical because it partly explains the way in which we have very derogatory terms for people that don't or are unable to participate in the labour market. So, we need to realise those earlier ideals, because the moral and imagination in that sort of society where we have a great deal of ignorance is always under siege, right, by fear. And to overcome that fear of the other, we need educated urban planners and so on, to design cities and green spaces where we can come together to embrace this diversity. So I really think we need daily encounters all the time with difference in public spaces, public transport, housing estates, schools, and workplaces. I just briefly want to mention economic security around this idea of a basic income, again, which is getting a lot of attention in the pandemic. And it's an idea that's an old idea, but really what it tries to do is break that relationship between income and labour, to say that we have a right to an economic, basic economic floor doesn't exist within a wage relation. That's really important, I think, in this age where paid work is becoming a less reliable source of income, rights and belonging. So we'll come back to this idea of UBI, but I think it's one of those ideas that's attractive in terms of providing an economic floor. So in terms of wrapping up, these are just a couple of ideas to start the conversation, thinking about what a well-rounded education is, what does economic security mean in the 21st century? And I think obviously there's a big lot that's involved in thinking about how we get from here to there, and that's what the other speakers will start to turn to. I think that these are worth thinking about, but they're not the only ingredients in terms of how we institutionalise compassion. I think, crisis, as I said, and the emotional response that follows, it kind of wakes us from our slumber, but it's never enough to change course, what the economists call path dependency. And to do that, I think to change course, we need to embed new norms if we want a new normal. So let's see how we can do that. As I said, that's not an easy journey, but I think if we're going to do it, this is the pandemic is one of those kind of portal moments where that might be possible. Thanks.
Greg, thank you. You outlined obviously a number of things governments need to think about to create more compassionate societies. I'm wondering, is there a government somewhere that's doing more of these policies than not, or where are there governments or places most amenable to making these sorts of changes?
Yeah, well, in terms of welfare states in the 20th century, we were kind of heading towards that kind of more social democratic tradition where, we would universalise some of these services. We've got various forms of that in terms of health and education. We've got some of that, but we've also got a very market-orientated society in terms of how we think about needs like like housing, how we think about how we're going to get an income. So we're kind of somewhere in the middle. But I think that the Scandinavian countries used to be held up as that example. But if you look at UBI and countries that are experimenting with that, both in developing and developed worlds, I think we could introduce some of those same experiments in this country, because people need to see the demonstration of those ideas to show that if you have a basic income, it doesn't mean people stop working. In fact, they continue to work, they continue to engage in education. But what it does is valorize all forms of work. And I think that's really important, particularly when you look at all the care work that got us through the pandemic. So I think there are good examples around the world. And this is one of the great things about policy transfer is looking at both other countries, but also looking back in time, because there's a lot of amnesia that happens in policy too. We forget actually that there's lots of good ideas. What we lack is political will and courage to implement them.
Good point. All right, thanks. We'll return to these ideas a little bit later, but for now, my next guest is Jennifer Nadel. Jennifer Nadel is the co-founder of Compassion in Politics UK, which lobbies for kinder and more equitable values to drive government decision-making. In 2019, The Guardian described compassion in politics as the movement to be hopeful for. Jennifer is a qualified barrister, author, political strategist, activist, and award-winning television journalist, reporting extensively on how the law discriminates against women. Her most recent book, We, A Manifesto for Women, co-authored with Gillian Anderson, yes, that Gillian Anderson, the actress, proposes practical ways to affect individual and societal change. Jennifer is a trustee of the Charity Inquest, which supports families whose relatives have died in custody. Jennifer, over to you.
Thank you so much, and it's wonderful to be here with you all. And I wanted to start by inviting you to think about the social justice issues that really touch your heart. You know, whether it's refugees drowning at sea or being denied access to a safe harbour, whether it's the increasing number, certainly in the UK, of families who are homeless, whether it's the rise in hunger. We have a huge hunger problem now in the UK, whether it is lack of protection for workers. All of these issues have the same fundamental cause, which is the absence of compassion. And having been an activist, having been a campaigner, trying to work across these areas, you know, in environmental campaigns and then housing campaigns, what I came to realize was that we wouldn't really achieve change. It would just be a game of whack-a-mole if we kept focusing on single issues alone, although they do have to be focused on. What we needed to do was to look at what the underlying cause was. And we identified that as the absence of compassion. If compassion were a basic prerequisite for the way we craft laws, the way we craft policies, the way we run the institutions that Greg was talking about, we would have a very different cultural, social, and political landscape. So our goal as an organisation is to try and inject compassion back into politics. And the way that we've come to this conclusion is also to look at what's happened over the last 30, 40 years, during my lifetime certainly, as we have seen compassion edged out of the political space and the collective good replaced by individual, quite toxic, self-competitive self-interest. So during the 1970s, certainly in the UK, we had a very strong sense of the social contract. The legacy of the Second World War and the settlement that followed it was very much alive in our social structures and our social fabric. But once the ideas of the neoliberal Friedman School of Economics started to take hold, we saw the dismantling of that social contract and the steady snipping away, the decimation of workers' rights and unions to protect those rights, the primacy of individual goal setting and the acceptability of huge disparities in wealth. And then, as Greg mentioned, the shaming that happens to those who do fall upon hard times. Suddenly they're to blame for having encountered misfortune in their lives, and they become scroungers or malingerers or people who are trying to work the system. And so we end up in a society that is divided, which blames and judges those who have least, and which increasingly doesn't recognize its obligations to its fellow humans. What do we do about that? Well, Compassion in Politics was set up with the very clear objective of trying to pull the political lever in the belief that what happens politically then has a knock-on effect culturally and socially, and also that it's the quickest way to achieve wide-scale change. So the first area we work in is trying to put compassion back into the substance of politics. What we would really like to see is a compassion test in the same way as we have equality and environmental legislation. This compassion test would ensure that no legislation was passed if it was going to cause more harm to those in the most vulnerable groups in society. We have a situation in the UK after the 2008 crash where those who had least paid the highest price for the economic crisis. So we saw a dramatic rise in homelessness, in hunger, and the poor are getting much poorer while the wealthy continue to get wealthy. So if this compassion test existed, that wouldn't be able to happen now. We wouldn't have the punitive, cruel sanction system that we have in the UK. We wouldn't have benefit levels set at a level where it's not actually possible to survive. We wouldn't have people working for wages that didn't provide enough income, and the basic income, which Greg mentioned, universal basic income, is very much one of the policies that we would like to see happen, along with a real living wage. You know, there is no point in providing state support if you provide it at a level where people are still not going to be able to feed themselves, or where they're going to have to choose between getting school shoes for their child or putting money in the electricity meter. And we have a return to that really sharp face of poverty in the UK. Since 2017, in the last 4 years, we have seen a doubling, not of poverty, but of destitution. That means people who can't afford the very basics, people who are going hungry. And the vast majority of those are families with children. So we have a very real crisis. And as Greg said, we have an opportunity. Someone who works in politics, we are always looking for a moment where we might be able to affect real meaningful change. What we have seen as a result of this crisis is the compassionate nature of our society. We have seen communities coming together. We have reaffirmed our collective commitment to the common good and to looking after our neighbours and making sure no one goes without. So we think this is a very, very important moment. And the second thing we are looking at is, and that we work with, is the way politics is conducted. As is the case in Australia, we have a first past the post system. We have a very binary tug of war system of politics where, like you, our benches are set a sword's length apart, 2 swords lengths apart from each other. And it's a tug of war over ideologies. You know, instead of having it pooling the collective wisdom to see how best to solve the problems that affect the most vulnerable in our society, we have a tug of war over rightness. So in the UK, we've set up an all-party parliamentary group, and its goal is to rally everyone around the flag of compassion, so that instead of putting party before country, which has happened a lot in the UK recently, particularly in the Brexit debate and outcome, we have compassion as the rallying flag. And we have MPs we've had active engagement with over 100 MPs from across the House on this. And we are working with those MPs to reform the way politics is conducted. You know, how can one arrive at compassionate policies if one is shouting across the floor of the House at the other side, or making animal noises, or braying, or shaming, or clapping, or jeering? So we think that that's really, really basic. And we work also in the area of online hate. And we say, you know, if people switch on the television or go online and see their politicians spewing hate at each other, how can that not have a knock-on effect? And obviously, we've been very saddened to read about the recent case in the Australian Parliament of rape, but that's something we also have experienced in our very patriarchal, archaic system in the UK. And clearly those practices have got to change, and we're working with the authorities to try and bring around change and have MP-led initiatives to try and do that. And finally, I just wanted to say something about the very notions of right and wrong. You know, those of us who want social change are very quick to point out the othering which is done to those groups. As Greg mentioned, you know, refugees become criminalized very quickly. But those of us who think we have right on our side, often who are left of centre, can other those that we disagree with. So we end up with this increasing division, and we've seen what happens with Trump in the US and with Brexit in the UK. We end up with these terrible, terrible divisions where each side is clutching their banner of rightness and using it as a sledgehammer or a weapon to attack the other side. And conversations about politics need to move beyond that very binary right, wrong, my way or the highway, and really come to a place where we're interested in how do we solve problems without attachment to ideology? How do we move beyond the politics of right and wrong to a place where we are really interested, our primary focus is on preventing harm and preventing avoidable suffering. Anyway, I look forward to hearing what everyone else is going to say.
Jennifer, thank you. I'm curious, you've identified, many issues in politics right now, toxic self-interest and the like that, aren't going to lend themselves to compassionate government. I'm wondering, in your conversations with politicians these days, are you finding there is, more openness to thinking about compassion, or is it still quite a struggle to get people to sort of move beyond how politics as usual has been?
Well, the first response we got when we launched was compassion in politics. Are you being ironic? There's an oxymoron. But very quickly, we found that politicians were incredibly receptive. They are very hated at the moment. They are not respected by the public. We see this huge loss of faith in democracy. And to have most politicians of whatever party are drawn to politics because they have some notion of the social good and wanting to make the world better. And we have found an extraordinary response. And we've had so many MPs saying, thank you for doing this. We can't have those conversations with the other side, but you provide a neutral space in which that can happen. And so, yeah, we've been blown away by the response we've had, and we now have groups springing up in the US and elsewhere, and we've had positive responses in Australia as well. So we're excited.
And in terms of having a compassion test for new laws, how amenable are the politicians you speak to about that?
Everyone likes the idea. On the right, we have the fear that sovereignty is somehow being taken away from us. But to that, we'd really say you can still do the policies you want to do. You just have to do them in a way that doesn't harm those who are most vulnerable. We're not saying you can't change your budgeting priorities. We're not saying you can't cut public spending. We're just saying do it in a way which doesn't hurt those who are the most vulnerable. So there is a fear of loss of sovereignty, but there's also a recognition that it could be an incredibly powerful lever to introduce.
Yeah, right, fair enough. Okay, thank you, Jennifer. Now we'll go to our third and final guest, and that's Yolanda JETTEN. Yolanda JETTEN is a professor of social psychology and ARC Laureate Fellow in the School of Psychology at the University of Queensland. Her research is concerned with group processes, social identity, economic inequality, and intergroup relations, exploring how these play a role in mental health and well-being. She co-authored with Frank Moles the book, The Wealth Paradox, Economic Prosperity and the Hardening of Attitudes. In 2014, Yolanda was awarded the European Association of Social Psychology's Kurt Lewin Medal. And a year later, she was created a Fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences in Australia. Yolanda, I'll hand over to you.
Thank you very much, Sana, for that lovely introduction. And I've been taking lots of notes because a lot of the things that I will talk about are rather sort of connect quite well, I guess, with points that Greg made and Jennifer made. But I guess I use slightly different language as a social psychologist and perhaps approach it from a slightly different angle, but rather similar topic, I think. So I would just want to make a very simple point, actually, that compassion goes along group lines. It travels along group lines. The very simple notion that we're more compassionate towards those that we consider to be part of our group than those that belong to other groups that we do not share membership with. So as Australians here in Brisbane, we feel more compassionate towards other Australians, more compassion for people here in Brisbane perhaps than for people in Melbourne or Sydney. And that is perhaps not surprising, because we spend more time with in-group members, we are more connected to them, we better understand them, we better understand their feelings, we trust them more. And also in the past, they've provided us with support, and we've also provided them with support. We've been compassionate towards them. But also we're more sensitive to their pain and suffering and more willing to help them. And many times that's not a problem at all, that we make these distinctions between those who are part of our group and those who are not. And in fact, you could even say that it's very adaptive, evolutionary. Of course, we always had to look after those who are close to us, or family or community, etc. But I guess the point I wanted to make is that it starts to be a problem when the care that we have for our own, those that share membership with us, goes at the expense of others who we see as not belonging to that same group. The problem starts to occur when we start to be uncaring for those others in other groups, and we're blind to their suffering, and we're not touched by their suffering. And that can be a very powerful dynamic, of course. So in our work, what we've been focusing on a lot is what is the type of structure of a society that triggers those more unhelpful sort of attitudes towards those that don't belong to our group. And the sort of structural feature of society that we focused on most is the level of inequality in a country, in a society. And by that, we simply mean how large is the gap between the poorest people and the wealthiest people in a society. And of course, we're not the first one who focus on that, but it's very clear that unequal societies are much more competitive, a point that Jennifer also made. And they're less trusting, they're more dangerous places, or people feel at least that they're more dangerous places. And importantly, we do find that there's far less compassion towards others. And again, I'm not blaming people necessarily. Those people are not bad people necessarily, the more unequal a society becomes. It is really the structural barriers to see certain things. At times, for instance, it is simply the case that wealthier individuals, wealthier groups, they live in different neighborhoods than poorer people. So it's, you know, in a way, they live their lives very separate from others. And can be quite ignorant of the needs of others in society who are perhaps not doing that well. And I was just thinking when I was sort of thinking about that today, I think that movie, Parasite, South Korean movie, is really showing that quite nicely, how people, because of they find themselves either as in the group of very wealthy or very poor, are actually cannot relate to each other and cannot show compassion towards each other. But what you have in societies that where you have those high levels of inequalities, of course, that they're very strong us-them dynamics. And even the case that's in extreme inequality, that's something that Jennifer, but also Craig, talk about, the whole idea that the poor become dehumanized. And of course, they're not worthy of compassion. That is at least a sentiment that you might see. And I fully agree with one of Jennifer's point that this is at the core of a lot of problems that we see in society. And I was thinking of Pope Francis, actually, that he was talking about economic inequality is the root of all social evil. Or even points that Obama made when he was president, that he really highlighted that economic inequality is not something only that the financial world needs to focus on, but it's also a moral problem. And it is a moral problem because it goes hand in hand with a lack of compassion and care for others. And just thought to say a little bit about our own work that speaks to some of these points. And one of the studies that I think is very powerful in this respect is some work that Kelly Kirkland, a PhD student who just finished here in the School of Psychology, what she did. Kelly is a developmental psychologist, and she did research among 4-year-olds. And she found these negative effects of inequality even among children as young as 4 years old. So just to quickly describe the study, what she has is 4-year-olds coming to the laboratory. They meet lots of puppets, and these puppets have either all 6 puppets that she meets, that the child meets, have the same amount of resources, so it's an equal world they find themselves in, or it is hugely unequal, whereby some puppets have an awful lot of resources, a lot of tokens, and others don't have anything. So it's an unequal world that they find themselves in. At the end of the study, the children who took part in the study, they get stickers for helping out as a reward for the participation. But then immediately after that, they're being shown a photo of a poor child who's suffering and would love to have some stickers. And what Kelly simply looked at, to what extent are they willing to share their stickers? Are they willing to give some to the poor children? And what she found is that children who've been playing in this world where there's a lot of inequality gave actually fewer stickers to that poor child. So in a sense, you can see that even at an age of 4, that you find less pro-social behavior, less compassion, actually, when the environment that we find ourselves in is in its structure is unequal. Other work that PhD students have been involved in is also showing that inequality enhances the need or the desire that people have for wealth and status. So it makes people focus more on material goods and less perhaps to the needs of others. In other work that we've found is that people in more unequal societies are more likely to show hostility towards newcomers, towards, say, immigrants to your society. And more generally, people also perceive those societies as more competitive and individualistic. And just linking it back to COVID, I think what COVID has done is put a real spotlight on all of this. It has brought a lot of those toxic processes to the surface. And have also shown us why inequality is such an important process when we talk about compassion. What we found actually in a lot of our work is that inequality prevents an effective response to crises such as COVID. COVID has also deepened inequalities in a sense that inequality has hit the most vulnerable people the hardest. And it also as I said, it compromised effective responses to COVID. Just the final point that I would like to make is that if we ask the question of how to enhance compassion across these group boundaries, if you actually accept my analysis that it has to do a lot with us-them dynamics, then maybe what you need to do, psychologically speaking at least, is create the broadest and most inclusive in-group that you can get. So it's no longer us versus them, but that you create a large and inclusive us. And I guess particularly in times of COVID, that sense of solidarity, sense of shared identity is absolutely crucial for holding communities together and also to enhance compassion. Okay, thank you. I'd like to leave it there.
Yolanda, thank you. Okay, it's sounding very much like inequality is at the core of a lot of these problems, but it occurs to me that inequality isn't really going anywhere anytime soon. So what can we as a society do to encourage compassion in such unideal circumstances, or are we sort of working uphill right now?
Unfortunately, yes. I think at the moment, especially when a crisis hits, as I said, that inequalities have actually deepened, and it becomes harder to overcome all those negative effects. And of course, I guess what Jennifer and also Greg were pointing out to, it requires political will, it requires good leadership. As a social psychologist, I would say it also requires leadership to bring the different groups together, to almost create that sense of, we're all in this together, and then not just have it as an empty slogan, but as something that is really aimed at enhancing that sense of solidarity, and that sense of, well, it is actually not your suffering and therefore your problem, but it is my problem too. So it is that sense of recategorization of we're all sort of in that together. Some of that has actually happened during COVID, make it very clear that we're all interdependent and that we're not islands. Even as countries, we're not islands. There needs to be a collective effort to overcome this. So I'm also a little bit hopeful that some of the inequalities can be overcome.
Okay, all right, let's expand this discussion and bring everyone else back in. So I invite JOLANDA, JETTEN, Jennifer Nadel, and Greg Marston to join us for the broader chat. And normally in a panel discussion, I'd say to the speakers, jump in if you have something to add to someone else's point. It is a bit harder on Zoom, but do so anyways. We want to make this a conversation as much as possible. And if nothing else, if you want to raise your hand and I'll know to come to you after, we can do that too. Now, I want to stay with sort of big picture and on the backdrop of sort of climate change and COVID and growing inequality and nationalism worldwide, it really does sort of feel like our societies are more fractured than ever, although as some of you suggest, COVID might be a turning point for that. But I'm wondering from each of your perspectives, whether you can put the current times in perspective and sort of orient us. Are we at a particularly uncompassionate point in time? Or does it just seem that way because the news is all negative or social media is an echo chamber or whatever else? So I might start with JOLANDA, since we were just with you now.
It's a hard one to answer, I guess, because there will be pockets of really beautiful sort of compassionate behavior, lots of helping pro-social behavior. And I'm thinking in particular early on in the pandemic that we saw many examples of neighbors for the first time actually talking to each other and sort of talking to how they could help each other. This sense of, I need to look after those that are dearest to me, my family members, and I need to protect them. So I guess there was also something there of, in a crisis that a lot of people actually sort of showed beautiful behavior in that sense. And that was all driven by care and compassion for others. But of course, also, we've seen because of structural inequality, there are also data there that, as I mentioned, that the poorest in society have been hit the hardest. And I would still say that there's not always the political will to really also bring them on board to enable them to actually overcome crises such as COVID. So, and there has been fracturing, of course, too. There's been politics going on and creating new us-them distinctions that undoes a lot of the goodwill that was there.
Greg, did you want to go next?
I think that, there are some clear differences, and obviously there's some continuities, but, technology and science and medicine and our capacity to respond to the pandemic have changed how we've done that. And even in, when we were socially isolating, we've had that capacity to connect in ways that we haven't in the past. So I think that's good. And we've also had that expression of being a good neighbour, as JOLANDA mentioned. So I think that, in one sense, yes, we've been here before. But I think at the same time, what's perhaps challenging is that we've perhaps not learning enough from the pandemic. So that rush, I think, to kind of reboot rather than reset, I think is somewhat disappointing for those that would hope we'd have some more imagination about how we do this differently. I mean, we all worked, particularly in knowledge industries, those who had the luxury of a knowledge job, managed to work from home. We reduced the congestion on the streets, air pollution went down, and even at universities, there's been some sense of kind of rush to get back to that face-to-face. And perhaps that reflects some of the ways in which we're not learning those lessons, because really it's important to have, a workforce that, thinks of their employer as an employer of choice. And we see that in the private sector, that some of these tech companies have been very quick to embrace that and not to go back to the way in which people were working before. So And, you know, and again, in terms of technology, we've also had the capacity to say that we could work less. You know, we could actually think about 4-day weeks and things like this. And this is what New Zealand's done in response to the pandemic. But again, we're kind of stuck in a very 20th century conception of how we work and what we think of work. And I think that that's one of our limitations. And, you know, I think we need some of the things that Yolanda and Jennifer talked about in terms of a political culture that is prepared to conduct some experiments that actually would show us that some of these things then can be, you know, ways in which we can extend and socialize these ideas a little bit more widely. So I'm both optimistic and, you know, I see it as a time where we can also be disappointed in the way in which we revert to some of these old habits. But, you know, I think we should try, and it's certainly beholden upon those that have got the jobs like we do to make sure that we're keeping that conversation, but ensuring that it's a diverse range of voices that are there as well.
And Jennifer, what do you make of that? Are we at a particularly uncompassionate point in time, or does it perhaps just feel that way sometimes?
No, I fear that we are. I mean, I agree with what Greg said, and during the response to the pandemic, there has been a reassertion of the things that matter most, you know, connection, quality of time, air quality, access to outside spaces. So we have been reminded, which gives us an opportunity to make this a moment of change. But at the same time, certainly in the UK and the US, hate has been unleashed in a way that we haven't seen in my lifetime. Levels of race hate are growing. The backlash against women's rights is growing. You know, I was speaking to the Speaker of the House of Commons, and he talked about the anti-woke movement within the Commons itself that sees any form of, you know, Black Lives Matter or women's rights as being an impingement of theirs and unnecessary frivolity. And even just on the streets, the levels of pent-up anger, and somehow that hate and that anger has found a legitimate outpouring. And I think we really have to take that very, very seriously. You know, hate and anger are easy go-to places when you're feeling frightened and insecure. They give you a sense of power. It's an illusion, but in that moment you feel as if you have some agency. And what we really need to do is look at how can we give people a real sense of agency over their lives and real choices, and focus on the antidote to anger and hate, which is providing a sense of security, social cohesion, connectedness, interrelatedness, that we are all dependent on each other. So I think we are at a worrying moment.
And so in terms of the policy changes that need to be made to sort of encourage more compassion in our societies, you all have sort of pointed to various policy, things that can be adopted, but I'm wondering, post-COVID-19, what is the most urgent thing that you think needs to change to encourage more compassion in society? Does anyone want to go first with that?
Well, the most urgent thing I see is the climate crisis, which is so intimately woven into the issue of compassion, because you know that competition for resources, for scarce resources, is going to get worse and worse as we have to start to compete for land that is habitable. So we are going to see a worsening of every situation unless we take really meaningful action to tackle climate change, and that integral to that is addressing inequality. So, I mean, I personally would like to see the Compassion Act that I mentioned as a necessary first step. But at the same time, we can't ignore climate change. It is right at the heart of every single thing that we need to do globally and nationally.
And Yolanda, I imagine, you might have something to say on inequality or perhaps something else, but what do you reckon?
Yeah, I think Jennifer made a good point that, I think every crisis provides a sort of an opportunity to rebuild better, right? And to get it right, because you break with normal practice of doing things. And also leaders, they are actually in a position to be a bit bold, and they need to be a bit bolder to really address the issues at hand, right? So, and I guess there is indeed a bit of an issue of, we've seen it in some ways, as Greg was talking about, that we think differently perhaps about working from home, the whole way that we structure work. But that's perhaps, I think that's a good development, but there are so many missed opportunities now. That's what I see is that politicians also here in Australia, where we've been relatively unaffected by COVID, who simply want to go back to the way it was and restore the status quo, which is disappointing to say the least. I fully agree. I mean, especially if you talk about the environmental crisis that is happening, going back to the way it was is simply not going to cut it. And it's going to, so it's clear that there needs to be that more imaginative leadership. And that is a bit, certainly something that I worry about, that we're not going to see that anywhere really, or I haven't seen it yet.
Greg, did you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think I agree with Jennifer and Yolanda in the sense that I think we need our social, economic and environmental goals, working in the same direction rather than trying to trade off, for example, between jobs and the environment, which, we know is not the case when we're looking at what we need to do in terms of greening and the economy. So that sense of sustainable prosperity is really important. So how do we refurbish the welfare state in the 21st century, I think? And I would prioritise it, addressing poverty for sure, because I think that we still have a preoccupation that poverty is a problem of character rather than cash. And that economic security does enable people to have the bandwidth to engage in the debates that we want them to do, to thicken the democracy in order to carry these conversations forward in a way that gets us doing things which we're timid about, like tax reform. If we want the sort of policies that are going to enable people to carry forward, then we're going to have to say that actually there's lots of welfare reform that we could do by cashing out lots of the tax advantages that people on high incomes have in home ownership or in rental investment properties and so on. We have this deliberate narrow conception of welfare that I think is very divisive. So I'd be doing something about that.
Yeah, Jennifer.
That's what you just said, Greg, about thickening the democracy. I just think that is so important, because one of the other things we've seen during this time is a loss of faith in politicians and the democratic process. And that, coupled with online hate, I mean, in the UK, the level of death threats, rape threats, threats to family that politicians receive if they speak out, some politicians have told me that their colleagues are frightened of stating their political truth on the floor of the House because of the repercussions that may happen to their families. And if we don't have a democracy if people are too scared to open their mouths, and we're on a superhighway to that position if we haven't already arrived at it.
Yeah, fair enough. I mean, I guess this is sort of painting a bit of a bleak picture. And I come back to the question of, in that case, where can we look to? Where is there a place, or is there, that is, getting this right, or thinking about changing in this way? Is there a government, local, national, state, anywhere that's sort of thinking this way? Yolanda, you said you hadn't really seen it anywhere.
Well, if it comes to crises, I think the evidence, for instance, with the Brisbane floods actually 10 years ago, suggests that inequalities deepened, right? So what actually happens is that, yes, it hits everyone, but those who are actually wealthier, they recover much quicker from it. And actually there is even evidence that they make a profit out of a crisis, whereas those who are at the poorer end of the spectrum, they many of them don't even recover from the hits that they're taking by not being able to work. So there are some deep issues, structural issues that suddenly all sort of come together and make it incredibly difficult for people to overcome it. And again, I mean, I think also, as I said, it requires bold leadership. It requires sensitivity to those inequalities, and also understand the political will to do so. Perhaps it's perhaps happening in New Zealand, perhaps the best example that I can think of. But it does, and it is unfortunate, because we know also from crisis recovery research that it is after crisis when you actually have the public is often quite positive about change. Let's try something else. Let's try actually fix this problem that we've been dealing with for so long, that we're not seeing that many politicians are actually willing to take it up and to really try and fix it, which is unfortunate.
Greg, did you have something you wanted to add to that?
So it's not so much, I guess, in the level of governments, but certainly in terms of citizens, I think that we see that they're setting the pace for policy change. And in some cases, it's governments that have to catch up. You know, when we do forums, for example, around thinking about basic income and who's attracted to that idea, it's people that are trying to combine different forms of income generation. They might be engaged in, you know, gig work, but they also want an economic floor. It's not like it's not an economic ceiling. It's a wage that's adequate to meet you know, living expenses, housing, food, and so on. But they're prepared to think about these ideas in a way that I think some people are fearful of that. And I think that can be overcome by demonstrations. As I said, there's some great trials that show that we can do this, but we should be prepared to fund those trials. You know, I do a lot of research for the moment on these cashless debit cards, which quarantine with my colleagues, quarantine people's income and don't allow them much freedom in terms of expenditure. And you know, what that shows is that stigmatization that goes along with that, you know, does a lot of harm in terms of people, and it creates divided communities. So I'd rather us, you know, stop spending millions of dollars on trials that show no evidence through countless evaluations that they work, and starting to fund some trials that could actually, on the best evidence, demonstrate greater economic security, greater community participation, capacity for people to, you know, continue education, training and things like that, to combine all these and to make these life transitions not as bumpy as they are. We've got to do a lot about smoothing those transitions in the life cycle. I think that's what I'd like to see us thinking about.
So you mentioned, you know, often politicians are catching up to what individuals want. So is this a matter of sort of individuals, you know, in activism, sort of pushing and driving for more compassion in politics? Is that ultimately what needs to happen to make sure our societies transform, that we as individuals sort of take responsibility for it?
Yeah, I mean, just really quickly, because I'm sure Jennifer and Yolanda want to say something on this, but you know, I think that history would demonstrate that that's always the case. You know, that public institutions haven't become more inclusive because of you know, benevolent governments. It's because people have struggled and fought against discrimination in terms of whether that was women who had to leave the workforce when they were pregnant or when they were married. You know, in this country, that now we say that's not okay. These are rights that we need to enshrine. I think that's really important in terms of putting a human rights and a sort of set of concrete policies and legal instruments around some of what we want to see reflected in society, because we can't always rely you know, on individuals or that sustained compassion that we see in response to a crisis, as the other speakers have mentioned. Jennifer
or Yolanda, did you want to jump in there?
Yeah, I just wanted to pick up on your point about leadership, because I mean, in the UK in particular, we look at New Zealand and see an authentic feeling leader, and we're very enamored with that idea. And you know, it's what do leaders appeal to? At the moment, we have leaders that use dog whistle politics and appeal to our most base instincts, you know, the easy go-to: anger, hate, entitlement, rage. But, you know, true leadership is about bringing out what's best in all of us. It's about appealing to the other side of us. And to pick up on what Greg said, you know, that is when we need campaigners and members of the community who speak the truth that most of us are feeling, yet isn't named on the political stage. And in the UK, we've had Marcus Rashford, the footballer, becoming the main spokesperson in favour of feeding children that are hungry during school breaks and during the time of COVID. The fact that it fell to a footballer who had himself come from that background to become the champion shows the failure of our political system, that none of our politicians were capable of leading that campaign. But nevertheless, he's had an amazing impact, and he has stirred and given voice to that compassion which resides within all of us. It's just whether it's culturally, you know, encouraged or smushed.
And Yolanda, did you want to add on that point before I move on?
Maybe just to say that I think those are indeed great points, that if we're going to see any sort of change in a good way, then it's probably has to come from communities and particular groups in society that are not giving up on the issue and keep on putting it back on the agenda and insisting on it. So certainly, and let's not forget, I mean, at times I do think, I agree with Greg, it does work in sort of shifting public opinion, and politicians are typically quite late in picking up those shifts. But there comes a moment with a couple of these things that it is no longer in a politician's interest to actually ignore what the public thinks. So those are perhaps the more sort of promising ways in creating a more compassionate society and getting that social change, what is needed to get a more sort of greater sense of solidarity, say, or support for particular policies.
That sort of segues to my next question, and that is, what are the consequences if we don't start addressing, including more compassion in our politics, in our society? How much bleaker can things get, basically?
A lot. First? Sorry, I'm going to be blunt about this. Things can get a lot bleaker. We are just almost, it feels, at the start of a new phase that none of us have experienced in our lifetimes of levels of hate and deprivation. We are in danger of returning to Victorian times where help is only given to those that feel most worthy, and philanthropists play God. Unless society and government steps in and really takes responsibility for addressing the inequalities that exist, we can no longer rely on a ridiculous notion of trickle-down economics and the growth and pursuit of wealth and growth as things that will naturally create a fairer, more equal society. And just one last point is that we need to look at how we define success. Using GDP to measure success, using levels of material wealth to measure success exacerbates the problem. We need to start measuring the things that really reflect our experience, all of our experiences of life.
Did anyone else want to jump in on consequences if we don't address compassion very soon?
Well, I fully agree with Jennifer. It can get a lot worse. And I was just thinking about, especially from thinking about the polarization, for instance, that's happening in the US, that you've seen actually over the last couple of months how things can get so out of control and can get quite dangerous. And in other countries too, I'm Dutch and I'm looking there now too at all the social unrest that has been happening there. And it is an issue there of leaders trying to deal with a crisis, but doing it actually by having a sort of very authoritarian way of, we know what's right for you, we're going to have a curfew, etc. We're going to do all these things and you just have to comply. So it is this lack of listening, it is lack of engagement. It is just lack of really trying to understand the mood of the public, and then it's interesting that the analysis that I've come across is very much of, why do you find social unrest? Because people don't really feel that they're being listened to, and it's that type of almost sort of society falling apart a little bit, and that's, well, why would I actually do what they say? So it can actually, I find it quite scary to watch some of that if you actually start to indeed not have that compassionate leadership to hold it together and to have that, try at least have that understanding of what people go through and how they're trying to cope.
Yeah, just quickly, I guess I would say that there is a kind of value in both thinking about that dystopian way in which it could get worse, but also there's a value in thinking about a utopian, in the sense not that we would have an ideal society, but at least thinking about a possible future rather than the kind of predictable future which we're talking about in a pessimistic sense, enables us to really kind of highlight what's wrong, in the present, in the way that Yolanda and Jennifer have talked about, the way that a pandemic doesn't so much change us, but it reveals and exposes all of those cracks and fissures. And that kind of awareness and knowledge of that, and that increased, experience of that, I think, is what motivates people in some sense to see the connectedness. So there is, I think, still lots of possibility. There's really much friction, which, friction by nature is unpredictable in terms of what the outcome would be. But again, history to some extent would say that if we go too far in one extreme, this is Polanyi's, great transformation thesis, that we do also go back the other way in terms of if we're hypermarket societies and hyper-individualized, that there are limits to that because, people don't accept social disorder and chaos either. It's why we ended up with the welfare state in some way. It pacified the working class, and now we can't live without the welfare state or live with it because it gives people a certain bare existence for people on very low incomes, but it doesn't give them enough in order to transform their lives. So I think that, we're certainly at risk of it, but, I think also one of the lessons again of the way in which we design social policies is that the more different classes and difference in terms of who's captured by that policy, the more resilient and resistant it becomes when governments try to take it away. We've learned that through universalising healthcare since the 50s. We learned that in terms of workplace legislation reforms to protect the rights of workers. So even though people may be declining in union membership, we still in this country believe in a fair go for workers, right? And when we've had governments that have tried to overreach in terms of workplace reforms, they've really come unstuck in terms of saying that you've crossed a line, and that's not acceptable. So I think, we should remember that those values to some extent are there. They just need to be cultivated and fostered.
Yeah, right.
I think I was just going to pick up on what Greg said. I think the piece that is really missing is vision. If we have a vision for where we want to go as a nation or as globally, then we feel a sense of hope, and with that hope comes energy and a sense of empowerment and a sense of agency. But the only vision certainly over here that we're seeing are the vision of returning to an island mentality where we're not bound by the Lilliputian ropes of fairness and equality, which is a really horrible vision, and it has been responded to by very base instinctive responses. So we need a vision that calls out the best of us, and that's where political leadership comes into it. We have a leader of the Labour Party who is just trying not to make a mistake. We cannot win this argument by facts alone. We live in a post-truth age where we are really dealing with people's emotional states, their psychology, and we can no longer rely on winning a cerebral argument in order to bring them with us. We need to talk to what makes us human. We need to bring out the best in all of us, and that does require leadership and vision.
Yeah, and Jennifer, I'm curious, in your conversations with politicians on the ground, is this sort of becoming more of a priority that is percolating, or people are still blinded about it? What's going on in the real world in your conversations with politicians there in the UK?
Well, it's kind of a war footing, and people aren't really able to step back enough to create that vision. Everyone is trying to troubleshoot. So Labour certainly is just trying to ameliorate the most harmful consequences of what the Conservative government is trying to do. The Conservative government is trying to get back to normal, and the Conservative government has actually started to talk about building back better, which shows that all our early conversations during this pandemic and the many webinars we hosted and engaged in about how do we build back better, but they've been co-opted, and building back better just means how do we get more of what we had before this pandemic hit. So I don't see anyone with the vision that's necessary. I see lots of really hardworking backbenchers, many of them women, and those women are talking across the House and have found a huge commonality between, in a sense, their femaleness is a greater loyalty than their party, but they're not in the positions of leadership that they would need to be in to be able to really take this vision forward.
So is your work getting harder at the moment then?
It's getting more longed for, but certainly there was a moment early on in the pandemic where everything was up for grabs, where it felt that there was a real fluidity, and this could be, that crisis opportunity where a phoenix could rise from the terrible ashes of this crisis. But now it has become hardened, and that anti-woke response, and we're not going to be told what to do and we'll carry on behaving just as we've always behaved, is very, very real amongst politicians as well as the public at large. So I hope that the window hasn't passed and the moment hasn't passed, but it feels that there is definitely a hardening.
Yeah, and Greg, and you mentioned, you worried the lessons of the pandemic weren't being learned. Does what Jennifer have to say sort of dovetail with how you're feeling about things at the moment?
Yeah, but I think that's, again, still, if we think about where change happens in the places that we are in our communities and our workplaces, then, I do think that we can look to lots of examples where it's that kind of idea of, 1,000 campfires rather than trying to wait for the one big moment in terms of thinking about what the social change would look like. But, I certainly think that in the political class, that, as Jennifer said, similarly in this country, there is very much a kind of returning to type in terms of the way in which we're having a debate about the future. And I think that's unfortunate, but it's also because to some extent the advice that is being sought and the way in which advisory committees are constituted around the recovery, are people in positions in corporations that are, got very vested interest in the old economy, not the new economy. So I think it's also, as I said earlier, about having that plurality is really important, both at the top, but certainly at the bottom, and creating that form of deliberation, because we do need to slow down that reasoning. I mean, that's one of the problems with technology and fast capitalism and the 24-hour news cycle, is that these discussions that we're having tonight, these are big issues with big investment that requires turning that ship around. It's going to need a whole engaged process that needs to be mapped carefully, not thinking about, am I going to win or lose my seat at the next election if I vote in a particular direction. So I think, it comes back to that piece about the importance of, we need the democratic institutions and our capacity to think well and to act clearly, I think. Really working in line with the policies, because it's like a good process doesn't guarantee a good policy, but a bad policy process will always guarantee a bad policy.
Yeah, right. And Yolanda, I mean, from your social psychology background, do you have any insight in terms of how, when inequality does get so entrenched, people have an incentive in maintaining the status quo? How do you start to convince the people that need to be convinced to, come along for the ride and work for a better time for everyone?
That's a big question, and if only I had the answer to that. I'm not sure. I guess what we do see, though, and I think Jennifer described some of that, really sort of that very dire state that you're in, when actually things really, society starts to break apart a little bit, starts to dissolve, and there's trust in leadership is gone. It's the social fabric starts to sort of disappear a little bit. So that is scary processes, and to be honest, I'm not quite sure that once you are actually in that downward spiral, if there are two scenarios, of course. It can either sort of completely crash, right? You're too far, you're going downhill, and it's just a negative spiral. Or that it actually does motivate people. Again, those dynamics that I talked about earlier, that crisis is also leading some people to actually being able to think about the future in a different way. Actually, you can think that maybe we don't have to keep on doing what we've always done, and there can be more creative solutions to that. I'm still hopeful that that's something that is a possibility. And I like what Greg was saying, is that maybe, in some areas of life, we've actually seen that COVID has sort of stimulated that progress and has actually led us in the right direction. Whereas there may be many other fields though where we've actually come to a standstill and things have gone downhill. So it's probably also unrealistic to wait for that big bang moment that oh God, everything is going wonderfully, everything is going in the right direction. But there are certainly small pockets, I think, where we've learned some important lessons about how to do it better, and maybe that is something to be hopeful for.
Yeah, fair enough. All right, I guess for those of us, oh yeah, Garrick, did you want to say something?
I was only going to say just really quickly, in terms of our own practices, as for Yolanda and I, at least as academics, we're having conversations around what does a sustainable academia look like, in terms of how much of that travel we were doing is still necessary, how much of the ways in which we connect digitally can be done in that way. So I think in our own institutions, it's really important to have those conversations, and again, for us as university leaders to show that leadership across the sector, because that change management piece is going to be quite difficult, but absolutely necessary when you think about the carbon footprint of an average academic or an average university. Lots of it's in in business travel.
Yeah, right. Okay, well, it sounds like, although this is a conversation about, compassion in society and the structures of society, it really sort of comes down in many cases to how we as individuals act or agitate for change. So I'm wondering, for those of us listening today, us as individuals, academics, professionals, what would you give us as a parting, thought from this conversation? What should we be thinking about? What should we be doing to try to contribute to a more compassionate society? Who wants to go first there?
I'll come in there. I think that we have to really remember who we really are and what matters, and become incredibly aware. I mean, Yolanda's a social psychologist, so I'm wary about treading on her domain. But a lot of this comes down to psychology. What is driving us? What's our motivation? And we each individually can take responsibility for improving our awareness of that. Are we acting from a place of, wielding power through our rightness or through our knowledge, or are we really focusing on what we have in common with each other, with our neighbours? And some of the conversation has been quite bleak during this conversation. So I just really wanted to give some reasons to be hopeful. And, human nature, compassion is innate. It can be found developmentally in all children. We're not talking about reinventing a wheel. We're just talking about reconnecting with who we are individually. And similarly, the whole point of society is to try to produce better outcomes for everyone within the group. The problem is, as Yolanda pointed out, is that the in-group has been becoming progressively smaller, and we do need to work on how do we expand that so that it stretches beyond immediate, people who are similar to us and beyond national borders. So I think that there is much to be hopeful for, and many of us have been forced because of the crisis to reconnect with that. And we all need to come out fighting for what we know is right. We can't remain silent. This is a dangerous moment, and we do need to speak the truth.
Who wanted to go next about what those of us in the audience should be thinking about as we leave this discussion on somewhat of a bleak note? Yes, but hopefully there are things to be hopeful for as well.
Just quickly, because I think it's a nice follow-on from what Jennifer was saying. I think that knowing your values is really important. So it's one of the things I tell students in social policy is that, reframing is kind of social change, and we can do that every day. So when we hear a stereotype or a label, we need to have the courage to say, actually, where does that come from? And why do you think like that? Because what cognitive science tells us, and again, this is going to psychology, but that frames matter more than facts. If you keep hitting people with the same facts who have got a very different mental frame, they ain't going to change. The way in which we think about taxation, for example, in some countries like the US, the predominant frame around taxation is as a form of theft. And again, in other countries, they see it as an investment in mitigating risk and pooling risk. And they use metaphors really powerfully about, paying taxes like a country club. Sure, you pay your dues, but you're going to get cheaper services, cheaper grog, cheaper food. So that reframing, I think, is really important, and I think it's really powerful to make sure that we're always working on those two levels. And I think that is a hopeful thing, because there's lots of ways in which those coalitions can become quite powerful with lots of diverse voices engaged in that process of reframing.
Yeah, all right. Okay, reframing how we talk about certain policies that would encourage compassion. All right, Yolanda, did you have a final thought on what we can do to encourage more compassion in society? Yolanda, have we lost you there?
She might be frozen.
I think she is frozen. Oh no. All right, I think we have lost her indeed. All right. In that case, I want to thank all my guests today. Greg Marston, thank you very much. Jennifer Nadel, thank you very much. And Yolanda JETTEN, thank you, although we have lost you already, unfortunately. Now, that's it for this week's discussion. I hope you will all join us next week when we will be exploring what it takes to achieve compassion on a global scale. My guest then will be the philosopher, author, and Princeton University professor of bioethics, Peter Singer, AC, Edinburgh University's Professor of Global Health and Development and co-director of the university's Global Compassion Initiative, Liz Grant, and the president of the Compassionate Mind Foundation and director of Derby University's Center for Compassion Research and Training, Paul Gilbert, OBE. That's all from Compassion and the New Normal this week. I want to give my thanks to our production team, Alistair Foster, James Kirby, Paul Purcell. I'm Sana Qadar. Catch you next time.